Graph analytics has a long history, and it really what came about because people were trying to understand how things are connected and study the relationship between things. And so, a lot of times in our world, we study the things themselves, but the relationships between them and how that actually can impact the future is something we don't really look as much into. So.
Amy, welcome to the Data Bites podcast. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here with us today. For our listeners, if you are not aware of Amy's incredible work, currently she's the founder and graph evangelist for Graph Geeks. Previously, she was the senior director at Relational AI, also worked at Fiddler as a responsible AI tech evangelist, and then a senior director of product marketing for graph analytics and data science and AI at Neo4j, excuse me. But in addition to that, she's written many different books as a co-author, as reports. We're going to dive into that today, but I'm excited to chat with you about graph analytics, knowledge graphs, and where the future of this is headed. So can you just explain to our listeners, what is graph analytics and why is that so important in our world today?
Thank you, Sadie. It's always a pleasure to speak, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk further about what's going on in the graph space. So, graph analytics has a long history, and it really what came about because people were trying to understand how things are connected and study the relationship between things. And so, a lot of times in our world, we study the things themselves, but the relationships between them and how that actually can impact the future is something we don't really look as much into. So, graph analytics is really about abstracting the structure of how things are connected. So, for instance, Amy knows Sadie. The verb knows is the connection between it or speaks with, and the entities or the nouns are Sadie and Amy. And so, just understanding that connection, and you can imagine with the complexity in our world today, between people, products, supplies, genomes, we could, healthcare, the connections between things are becoming more and more complex. And those connections, those relationships actually have shape and they have meaning. And so using those to kind of understand the network and understand what might happen or what might be a good pairing is really important. So if we think about a really simple example of like what movie someone might want to watch, understanding the connections that a human has or that I would have to the movies I've already watched and who acted in it or who wrote the script or what book it was based on can help make a recommendation for another book. But it's the same kind of structure and connections that can also help us see vulnerabilities, that can help logistics, supply chain issues and logistics be more efficient. They even use graphs to understand like the human condition as well and make better drug targeting and better patient care. So it's all over the place, and it's all just about understanding the connections between things and studying those with the importance that they deserve.
So I'm assuming that graph analytics has been around for quite some time, or knowledge graphs in general. Typically, we see that with technology, particularly in the world of like machine learning. All of these algorithms were invented quite some time ago. But what are the industries we're tending to see them really relevant in today, and who are more of the kind of fast adopters for knowledge graphs?
It's interesting. It's changed over time. Like I said, it's got a long history. But I would say graph analytics more than just graphs. The graphs being the data model that you use to abstract this information. That's been around for a long time. But analytics using the algorithms to compute over it, probably around World War II is actually when it started to become prevalent. And so you first saw it in that time period looking at logistics and energy systems as well, like electrical grid systems. But in the modern day, you see graph and graph analytics adopted a lot in financial sectors, especially for things like fraud detection. You'll quick Google and you'll find a ton of examples there. But financial services, banking, insurance, That's an area where you see a lot of early adoption for, like I said, anomaly detection, fraud detection. But you also see it a little bit in, or more so in, I would say, healthcare and life sciences. And I think part of that is because the life sciences community and the healthcare community are used to looking at the human body as a holistic system and how they interact with it, more holistically as well. So I think you see it, you definitely see it there. And then I would also say retail and manufacturing, especially for supply chain and logistics, probably more on the supply chain than on recommendations since COVID. So that's been an interesting shift to watch. And then I would say technology and telecom is another area where you see it as well for things like vulnerability and threat assessments, as well as things like a root cause and route planning.
So, because knowledge graphs are association based, they seem like they would play really well for a lot of the machine learning and really deep learning algorithms we use today, particularly even with the language models, right? Where a lot of times what it's doing is predicting that next word, which is oftentimes based on an association. Do you see knowledge graphs rising in popularity because of this? And can you talk a little bit more about how they aid in some of these machine learning and deep learning algorithms?
Yeah, I would say a couple different areas. Well, first off, the whole Gen AI LLM explosion has really, I would say, brought more highlight into knowledge graphs. And so we're actually seeing more people search on the term, more people come to various different websites that talk about knowledge graphs because of the popularity and people thinking about things more contextually and the importance of not just an answer, but the right answer for the right time and the right person that happens to be looking at it at that moment. But to back up it a little bit, even from that, kind of driving a little more attention, which is wonderful. It's great to have the attention on it. That we started to see several years ago the use of graphs to aid machine learning with really just the simple feature engineering. So if you are trying to develop or extract more predictive data from predictive elements from the data you already have, a lot of machine learning pipelines would pretty much just toss out the relationship based data, the structural data, and that data has meaning and it's very predictive of future behavior. And so just even simply using I'll call them simple, but and anyhow, but graph algorithms to extract out some information, whether it's a categorization or a score, like PageRank is a probably the most well-known graph algorithm, but just extract that out and put it into your machine learning would boost the results and improve the accuracy. So we saw that several years ago, and then we started to see people actually doing machine learning inside of a graph itself. Not as prevalent as the feature extraction because machine learning pipelines already being built out. It'd be more sense to augment that. But that's been on the rise as well. Is how do we actually learn inside of a graph to enhance our graph? So if I have a graph of um, oh, drugs that are used for different diseases, and I want to see new links, do new drug targeting, I'm trying to actually improve my graph. I'm trying to add to my graph. And so doing the machine learning inside the graph to predict links, possible targets, and then doing a full cycle makes a lot of sense. And so we've seen that on the rise prior to the explosion of the LLM models. Now with the LLM explosion, we're also seeing graphs used for things like grounding to improve results, kind of acting as almost like a guardrail for rules and what is even possible of responses to reduce hallucinations. I'm really interested to see people go beyond those simple steps and actually start to use graphs to do things like measure quality. So we talk a lot about hallucination when we know a result is totally wrong. Well, what if it's just not great? And I think we've seen a lot of that in our responses, like not a great response. Well, can we use the context that we're asking the question within to actually try to measure, quality as well? So those are, yeah, it's an exciting space.
Yeah, you mentioned it's for a simple feature, which is the feature engineering part of it, although that can be one of the most complex and time consuming portions, right? So while it may not be building the algorithm, or in some cases is, it's still, I feel, has a lot of value because it just allows you to get to that, MVP of a model so much faster. So, can you share some of your thoughts on just the future of graph analytics and knowledge graphs? Like, where do you see this technology heading and more so integrated in the next, things move fast. So, let's say 2 to 5 years.
They do move fast. So I think as far as like where graph analytics is heading, and I think we saw this with the, I'm talking about, well, it's very simple to do a graph algorithm and grab a feature. But that's probably the biggest. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there that people can use right away, and kind of get moving, and I think we haven't picked up the fruit on the ground yet. And so I think there's in the next couple of years, as tools get easier to use, so the technology may be there in general, but there's still a hurdle to overcome in graph thinking, in using, explaining descriptive analytics versus hey, this is a score, or this is I am predicting X will happen, as opposed to describing, my environment. And so I think there's a hurdle to overcome, and just in thinking in more networks and systems, and what they can do. And I do think one of the things that I'm really watching carefully is the vendors that are trying to reduce the barrier to entry with graphs. And because the thinking's a little different, the data modeling's a little different, the algorithms are a little different. They operate more holistically, and so you have these challenges with these really big data sets. And so any of the vendor, there are some really exciting things going on with LLM and NLP integration with graphs, so that you don't have to actually know what the data model is to do a good query. And so there's, just kind of reducing that barrier to entry there. But then also just like integrating the data better, so that we can integrate closer to relational data and don't have to do potentially a full, remodel of the data for a simple query. So those, I think, just reducing those barriers, integration, interface with humans, us darn humans, those are the areas that I think in the next maybe year, maybe not even 2 years, we're gonna see a lot of innovation there. And then I think the other innovations, kind of, I would say, are adjacent to other trends, so things like streaming, and being able to stream data in. That's not something that all graphs do very well, because they can be difficult to update. So there's a couple vendors out there that are doing some really exciting things in integrating streaming, and I think that's another area. Is like, how do we integrate it into our regular workflows as well? So those are some of the areas. There's also some really cool mathy stuff going on as well. There's HD graph, like higher dimensional graph math stuff that's going on as well. Is kind of exciting to watch. That's a little farther out, but I think people are looking at this graph format because it's very natural to the way we relate with the world. We use relationships and connections. So it's kind of exciting to see things kind of pushing out in that area, and doing things like looking at how do we do fuzzy abstractions of graphs and things like that. So I know it was a little rambly. Do you have? Yeah, is there anything in there that you'd like to talk a little more about?
Well, I'm curious about this concept of it relational works in a way that represents more of our real world. And I'd like to take it a step further, maybe even say that it also represents a little bit more accurately how our brain works too, right? Which is one of the pros of our brains, but also one of the cons of our brains too. We tend to use these heuristics that allow us to not use as much energy from our brain. But because of that, we also then develop these biases as well, where maybe something happened to us once and we apply it many times over and over to other things. So I'm curious of, you know, these graphs represent the world and more of the relationships in it. Is that what made you fall in love with this space in the first place? Or what was the gateway where you went all in on knowledge graphs? I mean, you authored almost 4 different books in this space. So this this is an area that you love, I think it's fair to say.
Oh, there's a phrase, you fall in love with anything the same way. It's while you're doing something else, and this kind of comes along. I think I fell in love with graphs when I started to look up complex systems, IoT systems, which I think there's a lot of future application in that area that's really interesting. And looking at emergent behavior and trying to understand how networks were behaving in a way that they were not programmed to. So it looks like intelligence, and some might argue that it is a form of intelligence. It's a technology, non-human, non-organic intelligence, perhaps. But it's very much the. I fell in love when I started to see these behaviors that weren't programmed, very much like you would see a murmuration of birds. That, as an individual level, birds aren't programmed to flock and swivel, in these ways, but when they're together, they do. And seeing that in a technology sense, and then learning that there is mathematics to try to describe that, and then to try to kind of understand underlying principles. From there, that was it. Like there's the underlying principles related to relationships that can kind of help us understand bigger behavior that we don't see at individual entities. So that's kind of how I fell in love with graphs. And it's you mentioned, so you mentioned something that I'd like to talk just a little bit more about. You mentioned the human brain and how graphs represent the way we think, which I agree. But one of the things that I'm excited to see that I haven't I haven't seen evolve yet with graphs, but I expect to, is the abstraction layers of that. So if you think about like how we think about things, we have this amazing ability, humans do, to understand and relate things and then abstract at all these different levels. So we have these high level fuzzy abstractions that allow us to reapply learnings without having to do the same thing 1,000 times, but to realize that it's inexact. So, for example, I burnt my hand as a child on the stove. Yeah, and like so many other kids, it looked red, and I put my hand on it. It was very painful. Never did that again. Didn't need to do it twice. But as opposed to going over to my neighbor's house and seeing a stove and going, "What's this stove going to do?" I don't have. It's not an exact matching. It's a fuzzy, abstracted matching. And so I think graphs do a really great job, from a data standpoint, of giving us great exact matches. And what I'm really excited about is some of the looks at these fuzzy matches and these abstractions at different layers, so that we can apply graph models more generally, but still be able to dig down into the specifics, just like a human can do. Like I remember the stove incident. Like I will never forget that. And I can understand it at an abstract level, but I can mentally drill down to the specific event if I need to. And so those are I feel like we are on the cusp of kind of moving into that in the graph land, as well as, abstracting at these different levels, but not losing exactness, if we need to drill down. So anyway, thank you for reminding me of that example.
No, and you make such a great point in regards to how the human brain works. Yes, it is a logical system. I mean, it's chemical and electrical, right? But we have all these orders of processing that I think is really something that makes it quite magical, let alone when you add this element of emotion, which for us is really what creates this deep encoding, right? Of an emotion of fear or sadness or happiness and joy. I tend to think that the fear and the sadness one gets prioritized in our memories a little bit better, where we tend to remember the bad moments a little bit more. But it'll be interesting to see what concepts we come up with in the data and AI space to add in that encoding, because it is so important, just as you mentioned, of this higher order of process and this abstraction to be able to make those associations. Well, it may not look exactly like the same stove from your house to your neighbor's house, but there's enough there, right, of that fuzzy matching to make it possible. So exciting things happening in this space. Do you have any more books coming out, or what's going on with all the books?
So I love to write, and I probably love to research as much as I like to write. So I am working on another book. It's going to take a little bit of time, as they all do, but we're hoping co-author and I are hoping to complete this year. So it is. We have a working title that will probably change. So I'll go ahead and tell your listeners, but don't hold me to this. But at the moment, we're talking about like patterns of power, and it's basically how to use the patterns of relationships to understand, see, and make changes in our lives, in geopolitical spaces, in networks and social in general, so that we can kind of understand how do power dynamics play out. What are the different types of power dynamics that we can see using data, and that we can see using, this won't surprise anybody, graph algorithms, in particular, a lot of centrality in this book. And then what can we do if we understand and see these patterns of power? What can we do to change outcomes for the better? So that's something that I'm very passionate about right now is, you know, being members of a community, but then also how do you use that influence? And influence is a form of power, to actually have better outcomes, and not just in my mind, not just hope for better outcomes, but how can we actually take action, especially as data professionals?
Yes, and what a relevant concept at this time in where we're at in humanity when so much does work from a social network standpoint. And I would say even more so because now so much of social networks are online, which means that communication and influence and power can move much faster and be changed from one person to another person. And so I'm really excited for this book because I think there can be a lot of positive outcomes to how do you identify those central points and use it for positive good, right? To make that positive change you want to see in the world. So I personally love the title. I hope it sticks. I don't know. When you work with publishers, you never know if they're going to stick with the title or not. But I love the title and I'm looking forward to this book. So tell me a little bit more about Graph Geeks. This is a new community you recently founded. What was the motivation for starting this community?
That's interesting that you asked me about the motivation. I was lonely. I left. So I love graphs, and I love talking to people who also like graphs. And whether it's research or a new podcast that's really exciting that mentioned them and or talked about it in a way that you've never thought of it. And there's just a lot of variety to network science and graphs and how people are using them out there. And I had left work, regular dated 9 to 5 work, so to speak, to work on the book. And last year, and what I noticed is I very quickly kind of lost my day-to-day conversations with my workmates, which often become my close friends as well. And I was missing the graphy chatter. I was missing being around people who had really silly centrality jokes, the two nodes walk into a bar, those kind of and those of us out there, really, we do that sort of thing. That there's just all these fun, silly things. And I really miss that. And I thought, well, I really want to focus on the book. I don't want to, but this is a big part of my life there's now not fulfilled. And so I started thinking about, well, what would it look like to try to fill that need that I had? And do other people feel like that as well? Do other people kind of want that kind of community? And so talking to a couple people and also talking to a lot of people in my network, which I was still talking to, but we worked together in one spot. So there was a lot of like pairwise conversations. And I'm like, well, how do I get to group together, the water cooler kind of effect? And what I realized is that there's a lot of communities out there that are vendor specific, or academic specific, even a certain type of research in graphs, very siloed. It's really kind of interesting to think about the graph people being siloed. But what I found is that academics were, in different areas and different universities, and vendors were in different areas. And then you have, just these, communities of, people who only do visualization on graphs. And so there's a lot out there, but they weren't, getting together and, kind of sharing ideas and research. And like I said, I miss the graph community very, very much when I wasn't at a vendor anymore. And then I realized that they're still out there. It's just, dude, I want to pick one and become siloed, or try to bring more of the group together. So that was my initial motivation. And then talking to people who were interested, the idea of a vendor neutral vendor participation. So we have vendors on the community, but very vendor neutral in the conversations, and the fact that it's open to anybody.
I can very much relate to your loneliness because that was a big inspiration of women in data as well. I gave a talk and I was like, sometimes just create something for you originally. It's totally okay. And particularly communities when you're getting started, it's nice to have that personal motivation. And then what's great is you find other people are wanting that same thing and come together and create something really impactful. So, what are the types of things you guys are focused on as a community today, and where do you hope the future of Graph Geeks goes?
So we just started it October of last year, and I'm not sure how it. I will say I started with a single one page website, which I still have, graphgeeks.org. And just kind of had a landing page and started talking to people. And it was December in which we launched the Discord channel, which people can get to through, well, either on Discord or through the website. And that's when things really started to happen. Is that we had people kind of join Discord, which is natural for conversations, and that's when the conversations happened. And we're focused right now on two things, and it'll probably change in 3 months. Who knows? But we're focused on just being helpful and answering questions and trying to encourage conversations, because that was the leading motivation, is how do we get people to have conversations, ask for help, ask for opinions of look at the dissertation that they might be working on, or a blog they might be working on, and try to get some support with the community. So that's the first thing, is conversations and support in finding information and testing out ideas. And the other thing is we've started to do once a month. I don't know if I want to call them a webinar. Let's call it, like, we're calling it Graph Geek Talks, where we'll have a talk once a month on any graphy topic. I'm sure at some point we'll have to be more organized, but at the moment it's like any graphy topic that the team or the group seems to be interested in. We'll do that as a way to kind of have those conversations, and also just share new ideas as well, and new research. So that's the focus right now. Again, I think by the end of the year we'll probably have more resources and maybe do more training and things like that. But at the moment, it's like, let's just find a place for people to get together and decide what they want the community to be, because that's the other thing that and I've talked a little to you about this as well, is that I may have started off with my interests, but I also and my need for community, but I also want to let the community figure out what's important to them and what direction that the people who are participating the most actually want to take it. And I'm not really sure where that will end up, but I'm kind of excited to see how that goes.
Yes, that's one of the, I think, most beautiful things about community is the community builds your roadmap. And this happened very naturally for women in data. We started with a local chapter and monthly meetings. And through those monthly meetings and conversation, you hear what the community wants and needs. So every year it was just always like a no brainer of like, okay, this is what we're going to focus on and this is what we do next. And it still happens to this date. We do an annual now membership survey. And last year a member gave us an idea of having like a buddy system, and so we launched it just a month ago, and it's been already like one of our most well received programs. And so I think that's such a beautiful fact about community is you get to listen and people are invested, and it's everyone who's a part of it that makes it what it is. So I love the approach you're taking. And it sounds like it's a great place for individuals if you're already working with these tools that you can come in and chat with others. But also, if you're new to the field, this is a great place to come in and get your questions answered, which is just fantastic.
I'm probably the most excited when I see uh, students join. So there's, we're having some university. I would like more, by the way, but we're having some university students that join. Maybe they're taking a comp sci class or a mathematics class, and somehow they trip over finding out about Graph Geeks and they join. I'm very excited. Sometimes they're very hesitant to ask questions. Um, Trying to encourage them to do that, but to have them come in and get have a good experience, and then having some people who've been in the graph space for a long time as well be able to actually do a little mentoring and kind of point people in different directions. I just feel like it has such a big impact that that it's just exciting to see people who are very new to the space come in and get value out of it. And I have a quick question for you, Sadie. So you mentioned growing the women in data community. You have thousands of members now worldwide. Can you how I guess any bit of advice, for me as I start to go down this path of maybe ways to maintain sanity or things not to do would be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, you're already doing all the right things, and the number one thing that I tell everyone is really just consistency. Particularly in community, we want people to show up. We want the community to show up, and what I tell myself, I remind myself, and I tell also our other chapter leads is if you want people to show up, you have to be consistent in showing up, right? So simple things of like having a monthly meeting is so helpful. People know, like, hey, I missed it this month, but I can catch next month because they always have it, right? And so that consistency over time really compounds. Partnerships are really key, and branching out into other groups, right? I mean, the world is so noisy. To get your name and your brand out there and finding the people who need it is always tricky. So finding other communities to partner with is always key. And then, most importantly, I would say is that listening to the community factor. I mean, we're 9 years into women in data. We're still listening and learning from our community, right? And I have like a very recent example with our buddy program that it works, right? Like the community never fails. And so when you really keep showing up, you keep that consistency and you keep just listening to the community and trying new things, it will grow over time. So, yeah, it's next year we'll be celebrating our 10-year anniversary, which I'm really excited for, which just like blows my mind away that it's been this long, but it also just goes to show what amazing things can happen when you stay consistent and just I look at it as I just create the flower bed. Everybody comes in and adds, a little bit to it and it grows, just create that environment where individuals can come in and share and grow together.
Well, thank you for being such a wonderful and positive example, for a community that can be a pleasant, good, supportive place for people to join and have a positive experience. So I've had such a positive experience with women in data, and it's interesting you mentioned the branch out to different organizations. So sometimes I'm a little shy about that because I like my own little group. But that's a really good encouragement to get out there and I think this is also part of it of you inviting and me to tell a little bit of my story and of course the Graph Geek story. So thank you on both counts.
Yes, and I'd encourage everybody to go check out graphgeeks.org. You can never one be a part of too many communities, but Amy is a wonderful individual, and a lot does stem from the founders kind of vision and environment that they set. So I have no doubt that this is a community that's going to be a welcoming and supportive place for everyone, and most importantly a place individuals can thrive and we can all grow together in this space. So thank you for starting this, and I can't wait to talk to you in 10 years and say, hey, where's Graph Geeks now? Hope we'll talk in between then, but in a 10-year time frame too. Awesome. Awesome. Amy, well, where's the best place for people to find your work, whether the books? I know we mentioned graphgeeks.org, but what if they want to connect with you individually?
Well, they can find me at graphgeeks.org. So there's contact information. That's probably the easiest. I always feel like that's the easiest place to remember because the words are the name is easy to spell, which was also an incentive for picking the name. Easy to spell. But I'm also pretty easy to find on LinkedIn as well, so they can find my work and history there. And I will. I haven't yet, which now reminds me something else I need to do is I will put a little more profile information on GraphGeek, so if people want to talk to me directly, that they can do that. And of course, I am on our Discord, so they can always reach me there as well.
Another good reason to join the community is you can easily get in touch with Amy as well. So, well, Amy, thank you again for coming on the show. This has been a fantastic interview. And to all our listeners, a big thank you. Remember to stay curious and keep learning. And we will catch you next time on the Data Bites podcast. Thanks, everybody. Bye. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Data Bites podcast. If you're looking for more resources to further your data career or find your tribe, we encourage you to become a member at womenindata.org. See you on the other side.